We acknowledge the Ancient Ones, the Greater Shamanic Council of Light, Hermes, Thoth, Trismegistus, and Seshet, Lady of the Measuring Cord, as above, so below, as within, so without. We acknowledge Imhotep, architect of the cosmos. May the earth be the mirror of heaven. We acknowledge the sacred order of the Magi, and all throughout history who knew, like now, a turning of the ages. We acknowledge the master builders of Göbekli Tepe and the great shining ones at Kalash. The courage and knowledge of the Polynesian wayfinders traversing the great oceans. We acknowledge the prophetic traditions of Ezekiel and Daniel, the traditions of Avalon, the Merlin, and the Round Table, the calendric wizardry of the Maya, and the Venus teachings from Mesoamerica, the Jupiter teachings originating in China, and the Vedic lunar mansion traditions, the Babylonian and Sumerian sidereal zodiacs, the brilliant Hellenistic invention of the seasonal zodiac. The Neolithic peoples around the planet, some still today, honoring the sacred connection between the land and the sky. The Tuatha De Danann in Ireland, who created a time of 2,000 years of peace, the builders of Newgrange. My teachers that are not in human form, Mount Shasta, the Grandfather Rock at the Wonderland of Rocks in Joshua Tree, Mount Haleakala on Maui, the Fish Lake Valley, Hierophany, and the sacred landscapes around the planet, the astrosophy of Rudolf Steiner, and the esoteric astrology of DK in the Tibetan, both presaging the shamanic astrology paradigm, and particularly the archetypal visions of C.G. Jung and the cosmology of my mentor, Dane Rajar. For these and more, we give thanks.
Everyone, it's that time again for my monthly video blog rant, and I'm joined here today by Awen Labow, our managing director, who will be helping me today. The subject of today is a greater elaboration of the Facebook post from last week, having to do with Jupiter and Mars in Aries, and focus on Aries. And this will be looking at a lot of aspects of that and doing an inquiry into Aries, into Jupiter and Mars together. And maybe why don't you bring up the first two slides? Nice imagery that was created, and here's the topics that we're going to hope to cover: the upcoming Jupiter-Mars conjunction in the morning sky, the Mars synodic cycle, which is now the overstory of Aries. Yes, so Mars is actually in Aries, and the overstory is Aries. We'll look at Jupiter and Aries historically, Chiron and Aries historically, because they're all in Aries right now. And then also as an extra feature, something I just became aware of recently, is that in that 1963 JFK assassination, which was just so critically important to actually anything having to do with the United States and what the United States is about in the world, that we're now at the Jupiter and Saturn return to the assassination, including Jupiter and Aries. So maybe a good way to tune in would be to, let's look at the chart of the conjunction. So this is calculated for the morning of the 29th, right at the exact conjunction, as it would be seen at 3:30 a.m. in Bisbee, Arizona, which, by the way, is the location of our first upcoming first in a long time event, in-person event. It'll be right there where Awen lives in Arizona. So you can see a lot of the features here of the morning sky now. Hopefully most of you by now have been able to check out the morning sky. Saturn is now quite high up in the morning sky, and Mars has been getting closer and closer and closer to Jupiter. Venus, which had also been in Aries, has just recently moved into Taurus. But still, all of them are still quite easily seen in the morning sky. Mercury is, for those that are following the physical experience of the visible planets, Mercury is now coming up in the also in the evening sky. I'm sorry, in the morning sky. Coming up in the morning sky. So we have. Wait a second. Isn't Mercury? It doesn't show Mercury retrograde there.
The red indicates that it's retrograde. The red numbers here.
Oh, okay. My program doesn't do that. Interesting. Right. So yes, a lot of attention had been on the Venus-Jupiter conjunction. It's certainly a bit more magnificently looking in the sky, but I think in many ways the Jupiter-Mars conjunction in Aries, if anything, is of equal significance, and is what I'm going to put forth is information that may even be more important at this time period in history. So woven into our conversation today, yeah, let's take a look at that one. Yeah, here we go. This is what you'll be seeing in the morning sky. Saturn pretty far up, Jupiter and Mars, Jupiter right above Mars, and then Venus getting now closer to the horizon a bit, but still easily visible before dawn. But we'll also be just having our investigation here of kind of all things Aries, and when we're talking about Jupiter Mars, I mean Jupiter conjunct Mars, or shall we say Mars joining Jupiter, Mars being the faster moving body. It's not that rare. It's more rare than Venus Jupiter. And Mars will go through Aries about once every couple of years. This is not as rare as something like, Jupiter conjunct Neptune, which we placed a lot of attention on. But for a lot of other reasons, I think this is just super important at this time period. And I'm talking about the time period of May, June, July of this year. So I mentioned.
You want to show here too that how
Go ahead.
just a reminder how signs and constellations are not the same thing, right? And that although this conjunction is happening in the sign of Aries here, which is the March equinox, it's actually in the constellation of the fish, right at the tail of the whale here, the sea monster.
And another thing that you can reference there is that you see where the knot of the cords of the fish are. So that was where the vernal equinox, the March equinox, was about 2,000 years ago, right at the knot. So now it's moved 2,000 years, and it's near the end of the fish right now. And actually is in the water stream. Underneath where that is are the water streams of the water bearer. So we now are getting a transmission from the fish to the sign of Aries, but which actually can add a certain amount of combustibility to what we know to be true about the sign of Aries. And then it's in an area of the sky which is water, fire and water. So that's might be a clue as to what can happen with this kind of a configuration. That's what it is that you're looking at when you look at the sky. Now, Eric Roth and myself do a long series over 2 years whenever Mars is doing its synodic cycle. And so I cannot use the time of our conversation today to go into the whole saga of Mars. Here we have the six phases of the Mars process. And it takes about 26 months in order for all of the phases of it to happen. What we're calling phase 1, which is the beginning of an overstory of Mars, is when Mars and the Sun are at opposition, or what is called the acronychal rise, which is when Mars, closest and brightest and retrograde, rises in the east as the Sun sets. And that's the time period in the Mars cycle where Mars will stay in the same sign for 6, 7, sometimes as long as 8 months. And that establishes the primary archetypal imagery of this particular version of the Mars journey. And it turns out that the one we're in is highlighting the sign of Aries. And then it'll turn out that we're right now where we are is in phase 5. You can see just the words on phase 5. When Mars enters the sign of the current overtone or overstory, and then ends when Mars enters the sign of the next story, which is actually going to be Gemini. And this is a less known way of looking at the Mars synodic cycle, less known than, say, how many people out there in the astrological community are looking at the Venus cycle in its different expressions. It's only slightly more, it's a year and a half, and it's easier to keep track of. But this is like 26 months. And Mars, being a less bright object, has tended to inspire less stories. But I think we have a really good framework on it, and it's really been working out quite well as it relates to where we are in the cycle now. So let's look at that next. Yes. So this is showing the main dates that in the time period we're in now. You can see there on May 24th, Mars entered Aries. And that is again the sign that Mars was in at the beginning of the overstory. And Mars generally will go through, it will only reach any given sign about every 2 years, so slightly more than 2 years. And then there's all these different things that are happening, including, you can see number 2 on the list, Mars conjunct Jupiter, which has inspired our investigation today. And then there's more things happening in this phase 5. Phase 5 we call Aries maturity and elder knowledge. More about that here shortly, about whether or not that's whether that can happen at this particular time period, and the necessity for that to happen at this time period. But it's the time period in the cycle where that's what the intent is, because phase 5 happens a considerable amount of time after Mars is in the underworld, which was back in phase 3. So this particular maturity and elder knowledge phase will last up until August 20th, when Mars enters Gemini, which is the sign of the next Sun-Mars opposition, which happens December 7th, 2022. So actually, just so this have the larger framework on this, from August 20th to December 7th, which we call phase 0, is the gestation and incubation period. If we think of it in terms of the lifespan of a human being, this August 20th through December 7th time period is more like in the womb, conception and in the womb. And the birthing has not happened until the beginning of phase 1, which will happen starting at December 7th. But the events that we're focusing on now as part of this inquiry are the ones there back in phase 5. Wisdom gained, possibly to integrate and assimilate in this Aries maturity and elder knowledge phase. So here we are now, Mars in Aries, but also Jupiter in Aries. One of the things also that inspired this inquiry was that noticing that since Jupiter is also in Aries, and Chiron are also in Aries, is that I was just wondering, when is it that they all happen together like that? As if, like, what is making this focus on Aries and this investigation of the Aries archetype super important? So if we think of the previous over stories of Mars, let's take a look at this. There's a lot of information on this this table that if those that are interested in a deeper dive into this, I really do suggest the seminars that I do with Eric. We'll have another one coming up in July. There's also been some seminars that are not part of that series where we talk about this.
There's also the synodic cycles online course. The full course goes really deep into the whole Mars cycle, right?
Yeah, in that course, which when it's presented in person takes about 5 days, but then we have the online version of it that you can take at your own speed. And that covers the synodic cycles of Mercury, Venus, Mars, and also the moon, looking at the moon, how the moon works from this perspective. But what I'm wanting to put your attention on here is that the overstory of Mars in Aries, and remember what that means is when there's a Sun-Mars opposition. There was one in 1894. There's one in 1909. Then we have to go all the way down to 1941. Then there was a super important one in 1988. And now here we had it begin October 13th, 2020. And so we're in the final phase of this Aries overstory. So I had been very curious to see how these different Aries alignments, whether there's more than one happening. And so far, I've just really discussed about the Mars overstory, and that Mars is now back into Aries ever since we have to go all the way back to the earlier part of 2020 for Mars to be in Aries. But in this understanding of the larger story, were there other time periods when there was an Aries overstory of Mars? It's not one of the most frequent ones. So here on this table, which has a lot of information beyond what we'll be talking about here today, and I'd like to suggest to you that if you're interested in this kind of these views, this type of view, I do again recommend the seminars I do with Eric, and we also have a course, an online course, and it's material that is produced in such a way that when it's done in person, it's taught over about 5 days. And it covers not just the Mars cycles, but also Venus and Mercury, and also the moon. But what I want to point your attention to here is the other time periods when the overstory for Mars was Aries. And you can see in 1894, 1909, and then you have to jump ahead to 1941. And then a really important one in 1988. Obviously, the one in 1941 would have been important. And then in the one that began October 13th, 2020. The start dates here are the oppositions of Mars and the Sun. When Mars is in the same sign for 6, 7, 8 months and begins the journey of that particular larger story of Mars. So we're in the Aries one now, and Mars is now back to its beginning point when it first entered into Aries way back in 2020. Now, what I was curious about was that the fact that, noticing that Jupiter is also in Aries, and that also Chiron is also in Aries. So let's look and see the time periods when Jupiter is in Aries. And it's about every 11 to 12 years. And the thing I was curious about was when Mars had its overstory in Aries, when is Jupiter always, is there any point where Jupiter is also in Aries? And actually, you can see from this, and before we began this video blog today, I was discussing this with Awen, and we looked back at the two previous ones to 1927, and they did not line up with the Mars overstory in Aries. You have to, Mars overstory in Aries only will occur with Jupiter in Aries, at least for the last 120 years, 130 years now. And so we can see the dates here of Jupiter in Aries, May 10th, 2022, December 20th, 2022, and then there's that there's the regression point that where it goes back into Pisces for a while, and then it completes May 16th, 2023. So certainly from May 10th until October 27th, we have Jupiter in Aries sharing the same sign as the overstory for Aries. Now, what about Chiron? There have been a number of presentations by myself and certainly plenty of other astrologers about Chiron and Aries. I always like to give a shout out to my colleague Dale O'Brien, who does, his specialty really is Chiron. And he's done some deep dives historically into the movement of Chiron through different signs. Can also mention here that the United States of America will be coming up to its 5th Chiron return in 2024, which also happens to be, where's that chart? Thought I had it here. Chiron and Aries, right? And those eclipses that are happening in 2024 also are very strongly aligned with the United States Chiron. But here we also find that really the only time that Chiron and Aries, at least in the last 120 years, corresponds with the Aries overstory for Mars is now. So it's like we have to look at Chiron in Aries, and we have to look at Jupiter in Aries, and then what inspired our inquiry today being the fact that the highlight in the sky, as if to get our attention, is Jupiter with Mars. And as anyone would know who follows anything astrologically, whatever Jupiter aligns with, it expands it, it amplifies it. And over these next weeks, we will also find that Mars will actually go up to Chiron, and I'm not sure whether that is listed on that other chart. Is that listed? Remember the phase 5. No, the elaboration of the different dates, and yes, I think he
Chiron
just,
conjunction?
yeah. So on June 15th, Mars conjunct Chiron at 15. I was trying to gosh, I have so many charts that I'm surrounded with here. I thought I had the U.S. chart here to access. I'm not remembering off the top of my head the exact degree of the U.S. Chiron. Thought I had gotten that out. That
I've got it here. It's
yeah.
Chiron is at 20 degrees.
Right. So that'll happen right around the solstice, when Mars will be conjuncting the moon. So just before that, it'll be a conjunction with the U.S. Chiron. Jupiter will not conjunct it until next year. because Jupiter is only going up to about 8 or 9 degrees of Aries. So let us just for a moment speculate on what this could all be about, and what it is that I've been sharing, and Eric and I have been sharing, and it's come up in different presentations the school has made. The attention is hugely on what in the world is Aries. And since 2,000 years, the sign of Aries has been identified with the planet Mars. In fact, they have, the Greeks gave them the same name, the god Aries and the sign Aries. And if you can imagine what the patriarchal cultures have understood Mars to be. It is perceived generally as aggression and warrior and war and things like that. But I'd like to suggest that is a overlay that comes from the culture. I mean, quite frankly, the Hellenistic culture that invented the sign-based zodiac were one of the most patriarchal cultures that has ever existed. Not only that, they were extremely hierarchical. They're always lauded as being this, the beginning of democracy, but there's only a very small percentage of the people who were part of the democracy. So there were, in fact, for about 200 years in Greece, women didn't even have names. It was so patriarchal. So I'm always like to bring up. In our investigation of the mystery schools of life and the planetary essences, that we have to try to dive into what their essence is, separate from what the cultural overlay has been. A really excellent book that explores it is James Hillman's last book, which is called A Terrible Love of War, which basically goes into what he believes is the hijack of Mars. Its original essence is that he was someone who was out in the fields. That later he became something that needed to be tamed and turned into professional armies. And actually that goes back to the Sumerian understanding of the constellation that is given the same name, which is that it was a field hand. It was not a ram at all. But the transformation of the constellation of what we call Aries, the constellation, was from a field hand or a hireling into the ram, which then became the symbol of the age of Aries. So it's a long investigation as far as what the ancients thought about that constellation. And then when the Greeks invented the zodiac, we know as the sign-based, or as my colleague Gemini Brett would always say, the directional zodiac, then actually it's placing those Greek meanings onto it, which is very young. Aries then becomes, what it became known through the ages as similar to the essence of Mars. And so there's can be a real confusion about that. Certainly Mars does represent some of the primary characteristics of youngness or, archetypal maleness, but that need not be something that would be associated with war or domination or killing or a negative sense of aggression. We are speculating here at this time that part of the project of our school is to revision how we perceive Mars, but particularly how we perceive a reperception, a re-imaging of Aries itself. So then it becomes something about protection, kind of, we could say, a warrior for peace, where basically the attention is on guardianship or protecting the planet, protecting her peoples, protecting the family, protecting the children. Even from a spiritual perspective, the protection of the cosmic order itself. Since it is archetypally masculine, it's going to have to do with with things like order. It's not a chaos principle. So maybe that's more related to the way that we're sort of like a quality that sometimes things need to be destroyed in order for things to grow afresh or new. But that's not the main primary of it. It's not Plutonian. It's not Kali-esque, but it's defending what one loves, and that's different than professional armies, aggression, the toxic qualities of patriarchal masculinity. All of these things are in the air right now. Certainly, everyone is aware of the war footing, and part of the reason why I just decided to look back at the JFK time, as we'll see in here in a while, is related to that being a similar time. We'll get to that in a few minutes. But take a look at these dates again, and you'll have this as a resource for our video blog today. And we are putting out our prayers that actually Aries maturity and elder knowledge will come through. And that's not just the old general, the 70, 80-year-old general is planning the next war, so it's another kind of maturity and elder knowledge. Could very much be about peacemaking rather than war making. So
I love that this is the Aries, that Mars is in Aries, but during the Aries overtone of the whole cycle. So it's already like this expanded understanding of Aries just by nature of the cycle that it is, but then to have Jupiter there further expanding it, and then Chiron there, exposing the mistakes, the wounds, the kind of wrong way that it's manifested in the past, and how rare that would be to bring all of these things out during this elder knowledge phase is.
Yeah, that will be the next part of what we can discuss here is that, so what is Chiron's function? There is, and as I should mention here that due to the eccentric orbit of Chiron, it doesn't spend the same amount of time in each sign. It actually spends the largest amount of time in Aries and Taurus, those two. So it's a good 7-8 years that Chiron is in Aries, and it's kind of right in the, you can see here that right in the middle of it, 15, when Mars conjuncts Chiron, and the US Chiron also in Aries, with a return in 2024. There's so much emphasis. I think it's getting a little better out there, but there's a lot of emphasis placed on the wounded healer, the wound of Chiron, but Chiron itself is not a wounder. So I like to think of it more as a teacher, but also as an indicator of where a wound or a fracture point is. So that if Chiron is in Aries during those 7 or 8 years that it's in Aries, then a theme of teaching and the location of where the wound or the fracture point would be becomes a major feature of it. And then considering that Jupiter will expand whatever it hits, whatever it aligns with, and that and Jupiter is now with Mars and is with Mars for a long time, for a while, for a couple of weeks is close, and it's expanding everything Mars and amplifying everything Mars. And then Chiron also there, and I think that we already mentioned that there isn't any time period in the last 150 years that Chiron in Aries corresponds to the Mars in Aries overstory. So we have this convergence of the Chiron initiatory process, the Jupiterian initiatory process, and the overall journey to gain elder knowledge and maturity of Mars in its 26-month cycle, also in Aries. So it would seem to me something has to give here. And the way I look at it is that the reason why Chiron, or we could say the purpose, the intention of Chiron and Aries, is to actually expose the things we're just talking about right now, and to actually provide a teaching there. But as all symbols of the underworld dimension, and Chiron we do allocate to the underworld dimension, it will also then bring up the shadow, or the things that have not been integrated, the things that have not been assimilated. So 2,000 years of a way of looking at Mars and Aries is up for review. To honestly look at that and to feel it is not something that Aries itself as a sign that doesn't have too much training in that. I mean, it's a very kind of black and white energy. It needs a mission and purpose, and it has highlight is commitment, and that can certainly be a certain form of willful stubbornness. How can there be a surrender to Aries? How can it attain vulnerability? Does it even know that vulnerability is a good thing, right? I can't. I'm always, whenever I consider this, I'm reminded of this old friend of mine with a huge amount of Aries, and it's in a men's group actually, and the thing about vulnerability came up, and so his response was, yes, let's get into this whole issue of vulnerability. Then I will know what I need to work on, meaning where he could protect himself more, not perceiving vulnerability itself as a strength. That also would have to do with the challenges associated with the process of grieving. If you know that there's a wound, if you become aware of the fact that the excesses of the patriarchal overlay since Hellenistic times has gone down onto Mars and Aries, what does it take for that sort of aggressive warrior energy to realize that that there has been collateral damage, not only to others but also to oneself? And I think that's the issue here, because if you look at what's happening as far as the United States' behavior, it's actually since the 80s, the last time that there was a Mars overstory in Aries, it's totally black and white. You're either for us or against us. You're with us or you're not. There's no turning back. You commit to a battle, and then there's no negotiation. There's no turning back. Kind of all in. Kind of sort of the neocon approach to the whole thing. This is all on the table right now, and I'm not trying to. I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, if you use the meanings of the last 2,000 years, Jupiter and Mars and Aries. If you give it a black and white interpretation, what? More war, more aggression, more commitment to black and white issues, which is interestingly part of the Aries medicine to be able to do that. I like to think of an imagery, since this is not just talking about men here at all. It has nothing to do with men. It has to do with patriarchal masculine archetypes, which can also be found in women. I always think of certain stories to illustrate this. The imagery of a mother bear. And maybe the mother bear believes their cubs are under attack. And so the bear attains supernatural strength in defense of the cubs. That's not mother nurture, it's mother defender. Or that marvelous tale of Queen Boudica. And the Romans were invading her small Celtic kingdom in Britain. And she was a fierce fighter to defend her people. And it is said that she was such a fierce protector of her people that the invading armies fled the battlefield in terror. We also have that great story from Egypt of Sekhmet, very sort of an Aries energy. And she was a battler. She went to battle, but they couldn't get her off the battlefield. They had to give her something to slow her down, which is what happened is they got her drunk, and then she stopped slaying the invading soldiers. So this whole revision of looking at the essence of Mars and the essence of Aries. Then we throw Jupiter in, and in the view of our school, when Jupiter moves into a different sign, that then becomes as a year star, as a year time period, the time period that Jupiter is in that sign, that becomes the Dharma for the current time period. So this is a further, same thing if you have Jupiter and Aries on your natal chart. I mean, that's your Dharma. I'm interpreting Dharma as a way of life, duties, responsibilities. It's all associated with current life purpose issues. And so if the primary energy of Dharma for the planet is Aries, then that's expanding everything else we've been talking about. And we'll also have that time period next year with Jupiter will be with Chiron, but we're presaging that now with Mars on Chiron on June 15th, right smack in the middle of the sign of Aries. Back to Chiron for a moment, then it's actually what? Expanding, amplifying where the location of the wound is. And then the purpose of Chiron is he's a healer. And it has healing medicine that bridges the immortals with the mortals, with humans and the animal kingdom. All those things are in his essence. So I'm just hopeful that we are in a situation where we're open for that teaching. Will Aries' stubborn, aggressive energy and over allegiance to black and whiteness, good guys and bad guys, white hats and black hats and whatever, be able to see beyond that into a larger story. And I think that's what the 26-month journey of Mars or overstory is about. Is to see a bigger, yeah.
It seems like this additional imagery here with the moon actually occulting Mars twice during this phase, which is pretty rare, isn't it? That you'd have a moon Mars occultation as well. And when I'm listening to you describe Chiron, showing the wound or covering up the fracture point, it kind of feels like the moon coming and actually covering Mars is also subduing of that warrior energy to allow for that to take place as well. Just
absolutely, and it's like the ceremonial approach we have in being able to be with the moon. I mean, the moon in our paradigm is lineage. But if we're looking at this on a collective basis, about when you have these moon conjunctions, that and I'm focus on the one in June, because that's moon in Aries, right? So, and it's with the occultation, is you're lining up the entire lineage of the Aries Mystery School coming through that point. And that includes both the light and the shadow of that. In fact, it gives the opportunity actually during that time period to go back to the time period before the imposition of patriarchal black and white definitions to the terms we use so often without thinking that there's a bigger story. I'm actually being able to tune in to what was actually happening with Aries before, back to the earlier mythic imagery of Mars, not the more recent ones. So those are, well, I mean, that June 20, and that's right at the solstice time too. And what an incredible time to do ceremony and, you know, prayers, meditation around this particular issue. But it can't just be love and light. I mean, because basically it's it's simultaneously envisioning a new Aries, you know, a whole new Aries mystery school, together with re-envisioning Mars, not just as some male warrior, but as being an archetype that works for both men and women. So it's gods and goddesses in every sign and every planet. But then to be able to be honest about where the fracture points have been, where the quote mistakes have been, and where to digest that, to assimilate it, to incorporate the shadow material associated with it. And that almost always involves a fair amount of grieving, you know. But you can't even grieve unless you know that there is something to grieve about, right? And there's so much in the Western culture that is lacking. You know, I think we're like called a death culture. So it's more like the overlay onto Mars and Aries is about death. Well, I'd like to suggest that there's another reframing of Aries. It's like a reframing of what the whole concept of being competitive is, because Aries is certainly competitive. But rather than winning and defeating the enemy or killing the enemy, it's more like going for your personal best. Be the best you can be. Personal best imagery is a really good one for Aries. And rather than having to, you know, winning is the only thing or something like that, which is something that's come in actually since the previous Mars in Aries overstory in the 80s. So there's so much to unpack with this. Maybe let's next look at that JFK chart. I was actually reading a remarkable book. I know that my generation, and I mean, I was 14. I was living in Thailand, 1962, 63, and I was there when Kennedy was killed. There were other events happening, including the CIA coup of Diem, who was the Prime Minister of Vietnam, that was happening at the same time. Those events always were also happening at the same time. There was also the time period when I was in school. You would do these drills to get under your desk, you know, because there was this fear of nuclear attack. And actually, JFK in the last year and a half of his life put in the test ban treaty. He stopped the missile crisis in Cuba, and he was engaged in major peace negotiations with Khrushchev. And those things all went down the drain when he was couped by well, most of the evidence is from the CIA. Anyway, it's from a book called JFK and the Unspeakable, which has gotten me to think about this again, by James Douglas. Incredible book. A lot of new stuff has come out about the assassination just in the last 10 or 15 years. Well, what got me thinking was looking at this chart of the assassination. And this year is the point of the 5th Jupiter return and the Saturn return, 2nd Saturn return to the assassination. You'll notice there that the 17 degrees in Aquarius, Saturn, the chart of the assassination is also, you look, 19 Aquarius, 11 Aquarius moon. You know, so Saturn has returned to that point for the 2nd time. But not to be missed is Jupiter at 948 Aries. Well, there's a couple of months coming up when Jupiter reaches the 8th degree of Aries, and that's the point where it goes stationary retrograde. So actually Jupiter will be within a degree of the natal Jupiter. I mean, not natal, but the chart of the assassination um, uh, over these next few months. And then it will cross over the 9 degrees in Aries point again in early 2023. I just find this to be highly significant. There are many individuals that have looked at this mythically, that the killing of Kennedy was like a ritual assassination of a king, the ritual killing of a king. And as they always say, that history does not always repeat, but it often rhymes. So what could be on the table here? That's just for you to think about over these next months, when there's so much emphasis on Aries, and then to notice that the assassination was also, Jupiter in Aries. Chiron is not in Aries. That was not a Mars overstory in Aries at that time period. But I think to keep that in mind, I mean, it's like calling it out, being aware of this kind of stuff. I don't think we're the only ones that are keeping track of these kinds of things, so it's our job to know about it, and then to re-image it, reimagine it, to, take it to another level, to actually have it be Aries elder wisdom and maturation, and a new Aries, a re-imaging, a new Mars and a new Aries. Remember here, for those who are listening, and we have so many people who are involved in the school. I'm probably we're not the only astrology organization like this, where the greatest number of participants are women. And so they might think, oh, he's just talking about men here. No, actually, we're referring to archetypes, not men and women. There are many women, let's say, that are still following the dictates of patriarchal masculinity. And also, if a woman has Mars in Aries, or Jupiter in Aries, or they happen to be in the Mars overstory, at birth of Aries, or they're going through a Mars return, or they're having something happening with these configurations, they're also part of the inquiry, part of the investigation of this revisioning of Aries, and really asking for there to be a teaching, an actual Chironic teaching coming through that allows us to integrate this. Jung actually, in the last 20 years of his life, put his whole attention on alchemy. And he's, famous for saying that if he had another 10 years to live, it would all be to study astrology, right? But he actually warned about the Western civilization. Not if it doesn't integrate its shadow, then we're looking at the end of what it's taken itself to be, and we need a whole new vision for going forward. And we're kind of in the nexus of that process right now. And this inquiry, a deeper dive into Jupiter and Mars and Aries. What are you reflecting on now as we discuss this, Alan?
Just, it's still feeling, how I didn't quite understand how remarkable this time period is, and I think it's really important that we work with these upcoming conjunctions, and especially those moon occultations seem like great times to, like you said, to let the lineage kind of come through as it covers over the progressive experience of the forward movement of Aries represented by Mars. We get the moon covering that over to kind of reflect on all those shadows and all of the lineage of Aries, and then it reveals Mars again, and we can sort of, it's almost like it feels like an eclipse sort of type experience that we can go through there and bring forward this sort of new vision of Aries. So,
Yeah, thanks for noticing that about the occultations. In fact, maybe as we're wrapping up our investigation here, let's look at back at that phase 5. We certainly didn't want to forget about pointing out July 1st.
right, and then right after is that.
Mars,
So
Mars scoring Pluto, right? Before Mars entering into Taurus. And one of the things that will be a feature of our June solstice seminars, we'll be doing a deeper dive into the upcoming alignments with Mars to Uranus in the North Node, and that will include certain important and critical connections to the eclipse degrees. Actually, Gail has been doing some research on that, and that'll be the feature of one of our 2 June seminars. In June, we'll be doing a free seminar on how you look at a chart according to our techniques about defining life purpose. That's more for everyone. I mean, total beginners approach. And then our second one, open to everybody, and these are free and by donation. We'll be looking at the next stage of the Mars elder maturity and wisdom, hopefully journey when it goes to Uranus in the North Node and has a connection to the nodal degrees, the eclipse degrees. But I guess what we're focusing on here now are the time periods when Mars is in Aries, where it squares Pluto, the occultation with the moon, the conjunction with Chiron, and that which has got our full attention to be able to do this inquiry now, which is the fact that they're so close in the morning sky. And ultimately, the best thing you can do, really, other than just know, I mean, obviously knowing some of this stuff is helpful, but to actually be with the configurations. I mean, those are living energies. So there's a transmission coming through when you're with them, and open yourself to the guidance that comes through. And maybe that will put that back up there again. I want to make reference to what you took here.
There we go.
So this was yesterday morning?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This was
so
the Venus moon
passed.
conjunction.
Yeah.
And this is Mars, the dimmer one there. It's moving this way.
And that'll still be quite, actually tomorrow morning, it will be the closest for those of you in the US, North America, Canada, Mexico, and so on, to have the closest Mars Jupiter. But by the time you look at the sky tomorrow, then we're already at new moon at the point, and you'll not see any crescent moon. You will see Venus still. Well, much to chew on there, and certainly welcome your feedback on this, and hopefully, well, I mean, the purpose of this, of course, is not to scare anybody about this, just to be aware of all 3 worlds. You know, that there is what's really happening. There's also our envisioning of, you know, the universe is unfolding as it should, a certain trust in providence and mercy from the Neptune presence, you know, the strong Neptune presence, that there is an Ananda connection happening here, and that we can connect to that larger feeling of being held by great mystery. And then there is the necessity, because of the connection here with Chiron, to be able to digest where have been the fracture points, the mistakes, the kinds of things that do need to be healed, which I'm suggesting is based on this cultural overlay and to how we think about Mars and Aries. It needs to be. I'll just say it straight. Those meanings, I believe, have been hijacked. It's been hijacked, and we need to kind of uncover what's deeper. And hopefully, this investigation has inspired you to do that.
Yeah, I always felt like Aries was one of the easiest archetypes to understand, but this is a great discussion.
And maybe that's actually part of its part of the deception about it, you know, because both its strength in its essence is the capacity to be committed, to be all in, you know. I mean, if you're protecting your homestead, you know, you want to have full Aries there, you know. It's also like it's not known for the objective cosmic overview, you know. So for example, there's that great story from, which I think is the best of all the shadow stories that I know of about Aries, which comes from Japan. It's the story of the Ronin, where you have this 12th, you know, highest level black belt initiate, and he is serving his lord. You know, I mean, he's basically he's working for whatever the shogun, or, you know, whatever they were calling the lords over there, right? And he discovers that the lord that he serves is a scoundrel. So then he ends up wandering the earth, called a Ronin. You know, basically like looking for something worth doing. It's sort of similar to all the stories of the Gulf War or Vietnam War veterans that come back, you know, and then it's not even whether or not they turned against the war. It's just that when they come back, there's nothing for them to do. You know, their skill set is not appreciated. You know, so they then become like Ronins, you know, and they know what they know how to do, which was applicable to war, but now what do you put it into? You know, these are classic Aries, you know, shadow stories. So our version of it is to incorporate that, to know the grieving necessary about it. I mean, who is grieving? The soldiers that die. Not a lot of individuals, or those that are victims, the collateral damage of what's happening in Yemen, what's happening in Somalia, what's happening in Syria, not just Ukraine, you know, all these other places where there's a whole heck of a lot of collateral damage to innocence, right? To grieve that, you know, and to get beyond the got to win, you know, just throw as many weapons and soldiers in as possible, you know. So that needs to be.
There's also the aspect of Aries being a fire sign that we haven't mentioned either, that I think gets lost. Well, at least the way we look at that in the school is that that's the intuitive function, so that there's almost this direct connection to spirit rather than just being all about fighting and listening to your commander and all of that. There's actually a call for Aries to develop a deeper spiritual connection where they're guided in that way. And that seems to be important.
And which is interesting, because we were talking about that also present in the field at this point is that even greater planetary relationship of Jupiter with Neptune, which we worked with. And so but then also that reminds me of the fact that like in the diagram that you put up, that this conjunction in Aries is actually in the area of the sky, which is water. You know, so if you look at it from the perspective of the constellations, that area of the sky is the water streams of the water bearer. It is the fish. Everything in that zone is water. So what happens when, from there's two ways of looking at it, you know. It's like what happens when fire is in water, you know, so you can see how that can be rather combustible, or, you know, they don't work too well together. But if you look at it from another perspective, and Jung's later work in alchemy was about this in his book called The Aeon and other of his writings, it was an inquiry into what is the contribution of the fish, you know, and actually looking at how the water jar is pouring water into the fish, and he perceiving that into a certain kind of redemptive, a universal love energy that is coming in through that portion of the sky. So rather than emphasizing the water, fire, combustibility, and incompatibility, it's like to embrace, to hold Aries with that Neptunian Ananda feminine force that comes from the one reality, you know. So that's another way of reframing it, I think.
Nice, I like that.
So I think that can, unless you can think of something else that we haven't covered, that can wrap it up for today. I think that with the resources that we've given you here, you know, with the dates of Jupiter in Aries, and with the overstory of Aries, Mars, and a way to work ceremonially with these different timings over these next weeks. You have a lot you can work with here as the events unfold in the collective field. Know that you can also tune into the larger stories here, and not just to be caught up in the. Try not to be try not to be in a position where you yourself are collateral damage. Let's put it that way, as this whole thing unfolds. All right. Thank you, Awen, for assisting on this, and I think we can close for now.
Hey, thank you, Daniel, for sharing all these insights.